Chapter 1. A game he didn't know he was in. The neon glow of Vorith Prime's largest space station, the Mirage, pulsed like a beacon in the vastness of space. It was a hub of commerce, diplomacy, and most notoriously entertainment. Here, traders gambled away fortunes in games they barely understood, bounty hunters rested between contracts, and thrill-seekers from across the galaxy came to witness spectacles beyond imagination. And somehow, David Carter had ended up here, completely by accident. David wasn't a gambler. He wasn't an adventurer. He was a mechanic, plain and simple. His job was fixing ships, patching up old FTL drives, and making sure reckless pilots didn't end up floating in the void. He'd spent the past 5 years working for the Union Mechanics Guild, hopping from station to station, doing honest work for honest pay. So how, exactly, did he find himself seated at the center of a packed arena, surrounded by a crowd of aliens, holding a handful of cards that he didn't even recognize, with a very serious-looking alien woman sitting across from him, watching his every move with piercing violet eyes? It had all started with a drink. One drink too many. David had landed on the Mirage for one simple reason. His ship needed repairs. The irony of a mechanic's vessel breaking down wasn't lost on him, but in his defense, it wasn't his ship. It was a guild rental, and whoever had used it before him had clearly not been kind to the engines. The problem? Repairs weren't cheap. And after realizing just how much it would cost to fix the FTL drive, David had done what any reasonable man in his situation would do. He found a bar, ordered a drink, and tried not to think about how broke he was. That's when Zahn showed up. Zahn was a 3-armed merchant from the Kelvar Consortium, and David had known him for years. They had met back on Epsilon 7, where David had once helped fix a Kelvar freighter in exchange for a crate of rare lubricants, which he later sold for 3 times their worth. Ever since then, whenever their paths crossed, Zahn always seemed to have a deal. "David," Zahn had exclaimed, slapping him on the back with one of his many arms. "You look like a man in need of credits." David had groaned. "No, I look like a man in need of a miracle." "Same thing." Zahn had grinned, sliding into the seat next to him. "Luckily for you, I know a way to make a lot of credits. Easy. Fast. No risks." David had sighed. "Zahn, the last time you said, 'no risks,' I ended up outrunning bounty hunters on Orion's belt. This is different." Zahn had insisted, waving his arms. "It's just a game. A simple card game. Play 1 round, win some credits, walk away. You don't even have to bet your own money. A sponsor covers the entry fee." David had frowned. "A sponsor? Who the hell would sponsor me?" Zahn had just grinned wider. David should have known that was a bad sign. The arena, which was how, 20 minutes later, David found himself in the center of a massive arena, seated at a round table, surrounded by hundreds of aliens watching from above, with bright neon screens displaying his face and name in 3 different languages. The game? He had no idea how to play it. The dealer, a tall, reptilian alien with 4 glowing eyes, had handed him a set of ornate, iridescent cards, their edges lined with some kind of shimmering energy field. The other players had nodded solemnly, their expressions serious, like warriors preparing for battle. And then there was the woman sitting across from him. She was taller than him, slender but strong, with violet-tinted skin and silver markings running down her arms. Her dark hair was braided, her clothing an elaborate mixture of armor and fabric that suggested both nobility and combat readiness. But it was her eyes that caught his attention, piercing violet, focused and unwavering. She was studying him, hard, and that made him very nervous. The dealer had explained the rules in rapid, complex detail, but David had understood about 5% of it. From what he could gather, it was a mix of poker, chess, and some kind of intergalactic strategy game that required both skill and luck, which meant he was screwed. Zahn, of course, had neglected to mention that part. David had sighed, running a hand through his hair. "All right," he muttered. "Let's just get this over with." The first round had gone surprisingly well. The second round? Even better. By the third round, the crowd had started cheering for him. And by the time he reached the final move, he realized something horrifying. He was winning. Like, really winning. And judging by the expression on the alien woman's face, that was not supposed to happen. Then, before he could even process what was going on, The dealer had slammed their hand against the table. The entire arena had erupted into deafening applause, and the neon screens had flashed bright red with the words, "Victory!" David had blinked. What? The alien woman across from him had slowly stood up, her gaze never leaving his. Then, in front of the entire crowd, she had dropped to one knee, placed a fist over her heart, and spoken in a language that David's translator barely managed to process. "I, Commander Velia of House Cyan, acknowledge my defeat. As per the sacred laws of the Invaran bonding trial, I submit to the victor's claim. I am yours." David stared. The crowd roared in approval. Zahn, somewhere in the audience, was screaming in excitement. David turned to the dealer, his brain still struggling to catch up. Wait. He pointed at Velia. "What do you mean submit to the victor's claim? What did I win?" The dealer, looking vaguely amused, simply replied, "Her hand in marriage." David felt his soul leave his body. The aftermath. David spent the next 10 minutes in what could only be described as a full-blown existential crisis. "I was playing a marriage game," he hissed at Zahn, who was currently doubling over with laughter. "Technically, you were playing a royal bonding trial," Zahn corrected between gasps. "It's a test of strategy and intellect. The winner is seen as the most worthy mate." David groaned, burying his face in his hands. "Zahn, I swear to every god in the galaxy, if I ever make it out of this, I am throwing you into the nearest sun." Velia, meanwhile, had remained calm and composed, watching David with a mixture of curiosity and mild irritation. "You did not know what the game was?" she finally asked. David sighed. "No, I thought I was playing for money." Velia arched an eyebrow. "Yet you won." "Yeah, on accident." She tilted her head, as if assessing him once again. Then, to his shock, she smirked. "Fascinating." David groaned. He was so doomed. Chapter 2. A human husband? Impossible. David Carter had never been more confused in his life. He had repaired damaged FTL drives in the middle of asteroid storms, he had jury-rigged emergency power systems inside collapsing space stations, and he had once survived a malfunctioning oxygen regulator on a long-haul cargo ship by siphoning breathable air from a fuel tank in a way that should not have worked, but nothing, compared to the absolute absurdity of what was happening to him now. He was standing in an alien temple, the air filled with the scent of burning incense, the walls covered in ancient glyphs that glowed faintly, and in front of him, staring at him with an expression that could only be described as mild disbelief, was Commander Velia of House Zion, the woman he had apparently just won in a royal marriage trial. David still wasn't entirely sure how it had happened. One minute, he had been playing a game he didn't understand, thinking he was gambling for some quick credits, and the next, he was engaged to a warrior commander from a species he barely knew anything about. How had this happened? The temple was filled with high-ranking Zion officials, all standing in their formal robes, watching the scene unfold with expressions that ranged from approval to outright confusion. Velia, meanwhile, looked irritated, but not in the way David had expected. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was more like she was annoyed that this was happening at all. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silence, she spoke. "You are not what I expected," she said, her voice calm but firm. David ran a hand through his hair. "Yeah, well, join the club." Velia's violet eyes narrowed slightly. "Do you understand what this means, human?" David exhaled. "You mean besides the fact that I'm apparently your husband now?" There was a murmur from the gathered Zion officials at that. The phrase human husband was clearly not something they were used to hearing. Velia's lips pressed into a thin line. "Yes, that." David sighed. "Look, can we just start from the beginning? Because I still don't entirely understand how I got into this mess." Velia folded her arms, her gaze steady. "You played the bonding trial. You won. By the laws of my people, that means you have proven yourself a worthy mate." David shook his head. "Yeah, see, I didn't know I was playing for marriage." Velia tilted her head. "Then why did you agree to the challenge?" David groaned. "I thought it was a normal card game. I was told I could win credits. No one said anything about winning a wife." The murmurs among the Zion officials grew louder. One of them, an older Zion man with silver tattoos running down his arms, finally stepped forward. "Commander Velia," he said, his tone heavy with formality. Do you wish to dispute the trial's outcome? Velia's jaw tightened slightly. David could see the gears turning in her mind. She wanted to say yes. He could tell. But then, to his surprise, she took a slow breath and said, "No, I do not dispute it." David's heart stopped for a second. Wait, what? He blinked at her. You don't? Velia exhaled, turning her sharp gaze back to him. The trial was fair. You won. To reject the outcome would be an insult to my honor. David felt his brain short-circuiting. So you're really going through with this? Velia frowned slightly. I do not know yet, but I will not bring shame upon my house by rejecting a trial's results. David ran a hand down his face. Okay, look, I get the whole honor thing, but isn't there a loophole? A way to I don't know undo this? One of the Zion officials, a woman with elaborate golden rings on her fingers, stepped forward. There is a way, she said, but it is not simple. David perked up immediately. Great. What is it? I'm all for not simple if it means I don't have to deal with an accidental intergalactic marriage. The woman studied him carefully before replying, to dissolve the bond, you must prove you are unworthy of it. David paused. Define unworthy. Velia's expression darkened slightly, as if she already knew where this was going. The official continued, if you were to demonstrate a lack of strength, intelligence, or honor, the bond would be considered invalid. You would be declared an unfit mate, and the trial would be nullified. David blinked slowly. So, let me get this straight. The only way to get out of this is to convince everyone here that I'm a terrible husband? The official nodded. Correct. David rubbed his temples. Okay, I can do this. I just need to be as obnoxious as possible, right? Easy. I'll just dash. Before he could finish, Velia's voice cut through the air like a blade. You will do no such thing. David froze. The entire room went silent. Velia stepped forward, her expression unreadable. If you attempt to disgrace yourself, it will reflect poorly upon me as well. If you make a mockery of this, you make a mockery of me. David felt his stomach twist slightly. He hadn't thought about that. Velia wasn't just some random person in this society, she was a commander, a warrior of high status. If he deliberately failed, it wouldn't just free him, it would humiliate her in front of her people. And for some reason, he didn't like that idea. David sighed, running a hand down his face. Okay, fine. No deliberately tanking it. So what now? Velia hesitated. Then, finally she said, for now, we follow tradition. There is a trial period before the bond is made permanent. During that time, we will determine if this union is viable. David blinked. Trial period? Velia exhaled. 1 month. We will live together, learn about each other. And at the end of that time, if it is clear that this bond is not sustainable, we will part ways. David frowned. And if it is sustainable? Velia's eyes locked onto his, her expression steady. Then we remain bonded. David stared at her. He had 1 month to convince an entire warrior species that this was a terrible idea. 1 month to figure out how the hell to undo a marriage trial that he didn't even know he was playing. 1 month to somehow survive living with an alien woman who was probably going to kill him in his sleep if he annoyed her too much. David sighed. Yeah, he muttered to himself. I am so screwed. Chapter 3. Coexisting with a Warrior Bride. David Carter had been in some uncomfortable situations before welding a fuel manifold while a ship was actively leaking oxygen, negotiating with angry cargo haulers after a repair job went south, surviving a week on nothing but protein bars and station-grade coffee, but none of it compared to this. He was now officially living with an alien warrior who, under normal circumstances, would never have even considered a human as a potential mate. And for the next 30 days, he had to somehow prove that they were fundamentally incompatible as a couple, without actively trying to humiliate himself or make her look bad in front of her people. It was a very delicate balancing act. The first problem? Velia's quarters. The temporary housing provided for them was in the heart of the Zion military sector, a place that looked more like a high-security fortress than a living space. The walls were metallic, the furniture minimalist and rigid, and everything about it screamed function over comfort. There were no soft chairs, no entertainment screens, no decorations, just an endless display of Zion efficiency and discipline. And of course, there was the issue of sleeping arrangements. David quickly realized that the concept of a bed in Zion culture was very different from what he was used to. Instead of a mattress, there was a firm, elevated platform covered in a type of woven metallic fabric, which was apparently designed for optimal spinal alignment. It felt like sleeping on a damn metal slab. The first night, David had really tried to get comfortable, but within 10 minutes, he had given up and resorted to rolling onto the floor instead, which led to the second problem: Vilia's reaction to him being human. She didn't say much at first, but she watched him constantly. Every time he did something even slightly unusual by Zion standards, she would tilt her head slightly, as if analyzing his every move. The first morning, David had made the mistake of stretching when he got up, letting out a groan as he tried to shake the stiffness from his limbs. Vilia had stared at him like he had grown a second head. "What?" she had finally asked. "Are you doing?" David blinked at her, rubbing the back of his neck. Stretching?" Vilia narrowed her eyes. "Why?" "Because I slept on the floor like a corpse for 8 hours, and now my entire body feels like it's made of stone?" She had studied him for a long moment, then simply shook her head. "Your species is fragile." David groaned. "Not fragile. Just used to actual beds." That conversation had set the tone for the next several days. Every time David did something even remotely human, Vilia had a reaction. When he made coffee, she had sniffed it suspiciously before asking, "Why do you willingly consume bitter liquid?" When he had hummed to himself while fixing a loose panel in their quarters, she had stared at him and asked, "What are you doing with your throat?" When he had let out an exhausted sigh after a long day, she had frowned. "Are you in pain?" It became a running pattern. David did something normal, and Vilia treated it like a strange anomaly that needed further study. But the biggest issue came when he tried to cook. Culinary conflicts. It started with breakfast. By the 5th day, David had officially had enough of the nutrient-packed, flavorless Zion ration bars that Vilia kept in her storage. They were efficient, sure, but they tasted like compressed dust with a hint of sadness. So he decided to make something himself. Unfortunately, he had failed to realize that Zion cooking traditions were vastly different from human ones. When Vilia walked into the kitchen and saw him scrambling eggs over a heat plate, she had immediately drawn a weapon. David had frozen mid-stir, staring at the gleaming dagger now pointed in his direction. Morning," he said cautiously. Vilia narrowed her eyes. "Why is there smoke coming from the pan?" David frowned, looking down at the eggs. "Because I'm cooking?" Vilia's grip on the knife didn't relax. "You are burning organic material for consumption?" David blinked. "Yes, that's literally what cooking is." Vilia's expression twisted in what looked like a mixture of shock and disapproval. "That is barbaric." David sighed, setting down the spatula. "Okay, look, I get it. Your people probably have some hyper-efficient way of consuming nutrients without needing to cook anything, but for humans, this is normal." She studied him for a long moment, then finally lowered the dagger, though she still looked deeply unsettled. David, deciding to take a risk, gestured to the plate. "You want to try it?" Vilia narrowed her eyes. "Absolutely not." "Come on," David said, smirking. "Where's that warrior spirit? Afraid of a little cooked food?" Her jaw tightened slightly. "I do not fear food." David picked up a fork, speared a piece of the eggs, and held it out to her. "Then prove it." Vilia glared at him, then at the fork, then back at him. Finally, with a reluctant sigh, she took the piece of egg and placed it in her mouth. For a second, she showed no reaction. Then her entire expression changed. Her eyes widened, her pupils dilating slightly, and she immediately turned away, as if trying to hide whatever visceral reaction she was having. David grinned. "You like it?" Vilia scowled. "It is acceptable." David laughed. "You totally like it." She shot him a warning glare, but the fact that she took another bite without complaint told him everything he needed to know. And just like that, David had won his first major battle in this strange accidental marriage. Strange, but not unpleasant. As the days passed, David and Vilia slowly began to settle into a rhythm. It wasn't smooth. By any means, Vilia was still rigid and formal, and David was still frustratingly casual in her eyes, but the tension that had existed in the beginning was starting to fade. They argued constantly over the smallest things, From how to store tools to whether or not it was necessary to clean their quarters every single night. Velia insisted it was. David thought it was excessive, but they also learned from each other. Velia started drinking coffee, even if she claimed it was only for the caffeine and not because she liked the taste. David learned how to read basic Zion script, thanks to Velia's relentless insistence that he at least attempt to understand her culture. And for the first time since this whole mess started, David didn't actually mind spending time with her. Maybe, just maybe, they were starting to figure out how to coexist. But there was one last problem. The end of the trial period was approaching, and David still wasn't sure what he was going to do. Chapter 4. The Final Decision. The 30-day trial period was coming to an end, and David Carter felt the weight of it settling over his shoulders like a heavy gravity field. A month ago, he had been nothing more than a wandering mechanic, hopping from one contract to the next, fixing ships, and trying not to get involved in anything messy. But somehow, through a series of bizarre and unforeseen events, he had ended up accidentally winning the hand of an alien warrior commander in a game he hadn't even realized he was playing. Now, after weeks of learning, adapting, arguing, and sharing the same living quarters, David had reached an unexpected and uncomfortable realization: he didn't actually hate it. Sure, the beginning had been a disaster. The misunderstandings, the cultural clashes, the fact that he had been forced into a situation where he had to convince an entire species that he wasn't fit to be a husband. But somewhere along the way, things had shifted. Velia was still fiercely disciplined, deeply serious, and absolutely impossible to impress. But she had also proven to be honorable, intelligent, and surprisingly willing to engage in the absurdity that was human culture. She had adapted, and so had he. Now, standing in the center of the Great Hall of the Zion High Council, David faced the final decision. Before him, a gathering of high-ranking Zion officials sat in elevated seats, their expressions unreadable. Velia stood to his right, dressed in her formal battle armor, her violet eyes steady, her posture as rigid as ever. This was it. This was the moment they would decide whether or not their union would become permanent. An elder Zion official, a man with silver markings carved into his skin, stepped forward. His deep voice echoed through the chamber. "The trial period has concluded," he announced. "By our laws, both parties must now declare whether they will honor the bond or dissolve it. Commander Velia of House Zion, do you find this union to be worthy?" The room fell into complete silence. David's heartbeat slammed against his ribs, and for the first time in his life, he realized he had no idea what she was going to say. Velia inhaled deeply. Then, she turned to face him, and what she said next shocked him to his core. "I have found him to be." She hesitated just for a fraction of a second before continuing. "Acceptable." David blinked. "Wait, what?" A murmur rippled through the gathered officials. Some of them seemed confused, others amused, but Velia's expression remained unreadable. The elder official raised an eyebrow. "You are choosing to honor the bond?" Velia stiffened slightly, and for the first time since David had met her, she looked genuinely uncertain. Not nervous, not reluctant, just unsure. David realized why. She had never been in a situation like this before. Zion culture was built on rigid traditions, duty, and honor. She had never been given the chance to make a decision like this for herself. This wasn't just about marriage. It was about choice. And she was making her own choice. David exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Well, damn." The elder official turned to him. "And you, human? Do you accept this bond?" Every logical part of David's brain was screaming at him to say no. This was supposed to be an accidental mistake, something he had been trying to escape from since day one. He had never planned for this, never thought that he would actually consider staying. But when he looked at Velia, standing there with that fierce determination in her eyes, something clicked into place. He liked her. Hell, maybe he even respected her. And if he left now, if he walked away and pretended this had never happened, then he knew he would regret it. So, with a long sigh and a half smirk, David turned to the elder official and said, "Yeah, I'm in." The hall erupted into shocked murmurs. Velia's eyes widened just a fraction, but she quickly schooled her expression into its usual stoic mask. The elder official nodded slowly, his silver markings glowing faintly. "Then it is decided. The bond is honored. By the laws of House Zion, you are now bound as mates." David barely had time to process that before Velia turned to him, crossed her arms, and muttered, "You are either incredibly foolish or incredibly brave." David grinned. "Why not both?" She stared at him for a long moment. Then, to his utter shock, she smirked. Just slightly. And in that moment, David realized something important. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. Epilogue. The start of something new. A week later, David Carter sat in what was now his new home, a heavily modified Zion living space, complete with an actual bed that didn't feel like a steel slab. He had won that battle, thank God. Velia was seated across from him, carefully reading through a technical manual on human engineering methods because, as she had put it, if I am to be bonded to a mechanic, I will at least understand his trade. David sipped his coffee, watching her with amusement. "So, how long before your people stop looking at me like I'm some kind of intergalactic anomaly?" Velia didn't look up. "Considering you are the first human to ever be bonded to a Zion warrior? Never." David sighed dramatically. "Figures." A pause. Then, after a moment, Velia glanced up at him. "You do not regret this?" David blinked. It was the first time she had asked him something that personal. He thought about it for a moment, then grinned. "Nah," he said. "Besides, if I ever get tired of this, I'll just challenge you to a rematch." Velia raised an eyebrow. "A rematch?" David leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Yeah, best 2 out of 3. Loser does the dishes for a year." She scoffed. "You are ridiculous. And yet, you married me." Velia rolled her eyes. But she didn't argue. And for David Carter, that was a victory in itself.